So, I'm stuck inside these days because the COVID-19 pandemic is continuing and has closed most of the museums I was planning to go to this summer and to take you along with me as I go to visit. So, we're going to try something a little bit different today, and we're going to have a couple more experiencing history videos coming out soon, but for now, we're going to try to be safe, and we're going to do a video that we can do from the comfort of our own home. And so, PhD students like myself do quite a lot of reading in our first years of studies for what we call our fields of study or fields of specialization. And I thought we might as well start kind of a book club of one so that I can talk to you about my thoughts and feelings about some of the books that I'm reading. So once in a while, I'm going to do a little bit more of a vloggy style video from the comfort of my own couch, where I'll just talk about some of the books that I have been reading. And it wasn't hard to decide which one I wanted to do first, which was, of course, Germs, The Fates of Human Societies by Jared Diamond, which is a book that I chose because it's been something that friends of mine have been talking to me about for years, but I hadn't actually read it until recently. And I find that it's an entry point for a lot of people into history. And I want to talk about some of the problems with the study, as well as some of the things I like about it. But mainly, I'm going to give you my 5 top critiques of Germs, coming from my perspective as a colonial North American historian. To clarify, before we jump in, you don't have to agree with me about this, or anything that I do on this channel. I am really excited about conversations in history and debates in how history should be done. So my perspective here might not be yours, and that is okay. So if you haven't already read the book, Diamond is essentially trying to answer a question that somebody that he encountered in Papua New Guinea asked him. So a man named Yali from Papua New Guinea asks him, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo, meaning material goods, and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? And Diamond abstracts this question to mean, why was it that the West was able to conquer or dominate other societies and other continents? And his answer is really that geology played a major role in determining how societies developed. And he argues that some societies were able to become literate and industrial with metal tools and domesticated animals, whereas others weren't able to do that by virtue of their environments. And so this is something that Diamond calls the accidents of geology. So he's trying to debunk a race-based analysis with this study, but he's doing what some people would, and I would call, geological determinism. So he's saying that your geology determined the outcome of your society. So I'm not going to go into more detail than that here. If you're interested in learning more about Diamond's book and what he's arguing, I will link to the audiobook version of Guns, Germs, and Steel, as well as a documentary that was made about the book in the description. Hello. So both lovers and haters of this book probably know that there's a lot of issues with Diamond's approach, and there have been a lot of videos done on that already. So I'm not going to go too much into specifically why his theory doesn't check out. I'm going to talk more about how he frames his study and some of the issues that I, as a person specializing in colonial North American history, find some of these problematic. As with all macro theories like this, Diamond makes a couple of generalizations that aren't really accurate, especially when applied to specific cases, and cases that aren't defined in the book. But to be brief on this, it's really, really hard to apply a theory to all of humanity that actually checks out in more cases than it doesn't. Often when we pose these macro theories, it works in a lot of the examples that come to mind first, but the more complexly we account for societies, the less these theories tend to make sense. So to be clear, my goal here isn't to chastise anyone for being persuaded by Jared Diamond's work. I think that he's a really compelling author. I think he does a great job outlining his argument. I just think there are a lot of blind spots in this book. talking about those blind spots is a really important thing to do, and hopefully it will, if you were persuaded by this argument, help you to start to be a little bit more critical of it. My biggest problem is with Diamond's own perspective and his apparent unawareness about how his position impacts his point of view. My first criticism of Guns, Germs, and Steel would be the assumption of objectivity here. So in his book, Diamond doesn't recognize his own biases, and he presents the ideas as kind of a common sense. And he's coming into the study with an idea about what it means for society to be successful, particularly, that is specific to his perspective as a white man of European descent. When Diamond's talking about societies that have succeeded, he's implying that conquered, and note the heavy air quotes here, societies failed in some way. This isn't an objective statement. It's based entirely on Diamond's belief that in a clash of cultures, that didn't really happen the way that he thinks it did. The effect is that he's placing blame for colonialism on human nature and on geology rather than on human agency and action. My second critique of Guns, Germs, and Steel is that it's deterministic. Diamond's book is working with a specific timeline of human progress that assumes that all societies fall somewhere along this linear progress narrative. You're probably familiar with this. This would be something like Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age, or hunter-gatherer to peasant farmer to industrialized. And these are convenient shorthand for anthropologists, but become problematic when applied to specific societies, and particularly indigenous societies. Diamond uses the words Stone Age quite often to refer to indigenous societies, which tends to connote that these communities are more primitive than Europeans, which isn't accurate. And what does primitive even mean in this context? If you're taking away a linear progress narrative, that doesn't really make sense in practice. It's important to remember that this progression was imagined based on how European societies changed over time, and the culture's failure to align with this linear progress narrative doesn't mean that it was more primitive or less sophisticated than European societies. And I think that Diamond's intention is there to dispute this, but he doesn't quite have the language to talk about this in an appropriate way. He's neglecting some of the cultural reasons that societies might have developed differently. For example, I'll link to an article in the description. There are reasons that South American societies and the Caribbean societies chose not to domesticate animals that go beyond simple inability to domesticate animals, which Jared Diamond seems not to be aware of. And that is a general problem here, is that he's following a certain idea that he has and not looking at the specifics of the societies he's talking about in each case. What he seems to imply is that all societies placed in the same environment would develop the same way, but this doesn't account for differences in religion or social practices that might change how different societies develop, even in the same environment. My third problem with Guns, Germs, and Steel is that Diamond is framing the study in a way that historians would call presentist. And what presentism is an attitude towards the past dominated by present-day attitudes and experiences. So he's basing his model of a successful empire on a particular European model of settler colonialism, where the legacies of colonialism are still visible today. And he's not accounting for how these different empires might have looked historically, and different empires that might not follow the exact model that he's using, or definition of empire that he's using. So, for example, the Comanche Empire is one that doesn't really fit his model. So he's just assuming that when he says empire, we're all on the same page about what that means. And we shouldn't be, because empire is a complicated thing to define. And what counts as an empire, what doesn't, gets messy depending on what you think matters. You're panting very loud, Frankie. So another critique of Germs and Steel is that Diamond doesn't try to incorporate human agency into his theory, and as a result, he's not providing a moral framework to his study. So by writing about, as he says, the fates of human societies, he's ignoring the ways in which colonizers repeatedly chose violence or repeatedly chose genocide and writing it up or chalking it up to these accidents of geology, focusing primarily on the means rather than on the motives. So he's not holding anyone to account for these actions, but instead suggesting that colonial endeavors were driven by human nature rather than, as in practice, commercial or religious reasons, among others. He's trying to understand what enabled Europeans to conquer other nations, but in order to even begin to answer that question, you have to understand why they would want to, and why other societies might not have the same desire. Oh, I've awoken Frankie. Which leads me to my final and largest criticism of this book, which is that it oversimplifies, which is kind of inherent to this kind of a study that is trying to account for all of humanity. He's trying to answer a question that colonial historians and colonized peoples have known the answers to for a long time, without really dealing with the complexity of different contexts. There isn't a single reason that explains why some nations started empires while others were swallowed into them, and to think otherwise is to flatten human experience into a single story. One of the reviews of this book that I really like was written by Thomas Lawson, and what he says is, Diamond recognizes that the human capacity for innovation is a powerful factor in the progress of societies. What he disputes is that there are peoples who are innately more capable of and receptive to innovation, and peoples who are less so. Indeed, there seems to be no evidence of any such native disparity among peoples around the world. On the contrary, Diamond makes the case compellingly that the capacity to achieve innovation and receptiveness to it varies enormously from society to society, on the same continent, and indeed, from time to time, in the same society. So far, so good, but at this point, Diamond, pushing his environmental determinism, takes a rather grand leap. He implies that, in the broad sweep of history, differences in human creativity come out in the wash. One could persuasively oppose Diamond's hypothesis with an argument that not environmental determinism, but rather cultural evolution charted the course of human development. So, with all these problems, why do I think it's so valuable to read Germs and Steel in 2021, over 2 decades after it was written? Well, in short, I don't, if it's the only thing that you're going to read. I think this is a book that has valuable lessons to offer when it's read in conversation with other works in line with current views on imperialism. So some of these would be Amit Singh's work, which is called Friction, which is looking at the ways in which societies coming together created friction rather than having this narrative of one dominating the other. Another could be Mike Davis's book, Late Victorian Holocaust, which is a book that should come with a content warning. It has some pretty graphic descriptions of human suffering, but I think it's one that is valuable because it has a really great description of how policy decisions made in empire can cause some of these issues in the societies that they occupy, as well as what environmental determinism is and how to avoid it in your own writing, or to look for it in other works. So Diamond, he addresses what environmental determinism is in the book, and then proceeds to do it. So this is a better example in Mike Davis's book of why that's a problem. Another one could be Walter Rodney's book, which is well known, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, or Lisa Lowe's book called Intimacies of Four Continents, for something that is another kind of continental approach looking at different societies in a global study. I still think it's important to read Guns, Germs, and Steel because authors refer back to it all the time, and it's like really important to know what exactly they're referring to. So it's good to know the broad strokes of Diamond's argument. And also because it's a genuinely well-written book, and I think we as academic historians sometimes have a hesitance to read anything that's popular or anything that's written for a non-academic audience. And I don't think that's good. I think that we should be reading more popular histories. And I think that it's good to see that more academic historians are engaging in writing histories that aren't just for other academics. I think if we only read books written by stuffy old academics who are using a lot of jargon and genuinely suck at writing readable books, we're more likely to reproduce the same. And I think writing in a way that is enjoyable isn't to mark against. But that is my controversial opinion among some circles. So if you're still with me, I hope you'll go on to read Guns, Germs, and Steel if you haven't, or if you have, you'll go on to read some of the other books that I've mentioned here or others that they mention. And that's all I really wanted to say about it.